All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. You want to introduce yourself to the good people and give a little summary of why we're chatting today?
Yes. My name is Dan Norton. Sorry to... I have a YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Dan Norton1. I'm a supporter of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. It's a philosophy of reason, egoism, and capitalism. So that's a little nutshell of the positions that I support. And I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely. So to kind of preface it all, for the audience, this is super reductive, but to give a sense of kind of like, where is this conversation going, and why do we feel like there's something to debate about? A lot of people compare objectivists to libertarianism. Obviously, I understand the distinction, even just one being a philosophical lens and one being a political lens. But I do think there seems to be a lot of overlap, even though I recognize a lot of objectivists that I've heard from don't like being called simply libertarian. But to give a sense to the audience, definitely a super, super limited government type belief system and all that good stuff. So to give you kind of a feel for where I wanted the conversation to go, I'm not so interested in getting super abstract. We can go there just to kind of, so you can be able to say your piece on what you believe in case anyone's interested. But I'm not too interested in going so abstract and philosophical that we're detached from real day-to-day issues. So you'll notice I'm going to want to keep bringing it back to, well, how does that apply to this set of issues or these certain political topics? So that's kind of a warning on that. But with that being said, I'll just kind of start firing stuff. If you have any big points you want to make, just say, this is unrelated, but I want to make sure I get this in. No problem at all. But initially, I watched a little bit of one of your conversations with someone else and heard you say that you're kind of someone who believes that taxation is wrong / like a taxationist theft person. You want to give your thoughts on that?
Sure. Since you mentioned libertarianism, I can just say a couple words on that, in case anyone wants to hear about the difference between objectivism and libertarianism. So one big difference is that objectivism is an entire philosophy. It's not just a political philosophy. So it has views in metaphysics, the basic nature of reality, epistemology, the basic nature of knowledge, views in ethics. Ayn Rand is pro-egoism. And then on top of all of that, you get to her political philosophy. So she has a very robust foundation that underlies and gives rise to her views in politics. It's not just a free-floating kind of system, whereas a lot of libertarians, they just start with the politics as a kind of groundwork right there. That's their axiom, divorced from all the underlying framework which Ayn Rand sets in place. And I think that's one major difference. It's an entire philosophy. Another difference is that a lot of libertarians, they are also anarchists, so that they don't just want a limited government, they want no state at all. And that's definitely not Ayn Rand's view. So some libertarians, they do want a state, so there's variation there, but just want to make it clear that objectivism is definitely not anti-state in the sense that it's thinks there should be no state at all. It's just anti-statism. They don't think the state should be all-powerful and dictating people's lives. People should have individual rights and decide how to live their own lives. Right. So that's just a little.
I will say, I heard you say that point. I don't think many mainstream libertarians these days are anarchists. I think anarchists are anarchists, but I hear what you're saying, and just think most libertarians are kind of like small government, except for on some things, depending on the particular libertarian. But regardless of the comparison between the two, from now on, I'm totally great just going forward as, objectivist purely.
Okay. Or at least heavily influenced by objectivism. There might be some small things where I differ, but that's fine. So you had asked about taxation. I do think taxation is wrong. I think it's immoral. I think it's a violation of people's rights, because it coerces people, and I'm against coercion. Ayn Rand is against coercion. So she thinks that people should have a right to what they produce, and the government should not have a right to coercively take that money away under threat of sending you to jail if you decide you don't want to pay your taxes. She would say that's a violation of people's property rights. So yeah, I am opposed to taxation as immoral and a violation of rights.
Right. So then the obvious question is, there are things that a government very effectively provides. I don't know where you stand on different things, but in my opinion, at a basic level, infrastructure, being able to have roads that are already, pre-provided for you, a police department, a fire department, education, all those types of things that even the most conservative people I talk to are usually like, yeah, that's for the good. And that's why most people, I think, accept taxation. We'll get to coercion kind of being antithetical to your whole view in a second, but just how do you respond to the fact that, okay, then how do you do anything with a government?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to remember that for over 100 years, America didn't have an income tax. So it's not like the country couldn't survive without an income tax. There were some tariffs at the beginning of the country. There was a little bit of taxation in the 19th century in the Civil War, but then that was repealed and it came back a few decades later. But the country grew tremendously in the 19th century. It was an era of tremendous progress. Millions of immigrants came from Europe to this country.
There was 100% mandatory taxation throughout that period.
It wasn't until 1913 that there was an income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment. Prior to that, there was little to no taxation. And when it got started, most people, they were paying 0 or only 1% on their incomes, and now we're up to 30% or 40%, depending on your bracket. It's vastly larger. So it's not like you need taxation to run a country. It was a change that came about later in our country's development. But there are voluntary ways to finance the appropriate functions of government, which, by the way, are far fewer in Ayn Rand's view than many people take them to be. So the only proper functions of government, according to Objectivism, are police, military, and courts. In other words, the functions that protect people from force. So you have police to protect you from domestic criminals. You have a military to protect you from foreign invaders. And then you have a court system to peacefully settle disputes among people. But aside from that, there's nothing else for the government to do. I mean, there is a legislature to create laws, but the vast welfare state
we'll definitely
we have today
just like
exist.
Next point will be even for those things, how do you pay for them? But before we go to that, in the pre-income tax, there was taxes on commodities and stuff like that. I recognize that the government was much smaller and more limited, and so then as people wanted more provided, you have to buy in more, in the form of taxes. So then different ways were introduced, and definitely I agree that we definitely pay more in taxes now, but there was definitely mandatory taxation when you're purchasing items, for example.
Yeah, I don't know all the history about what excise taxes or duties or imposts there might have been. So
and on properties,
I'm not doubting that there were some coercive elements. I'm just saying it was vastly smaller, so you don't need a vast regulatory taxation apparatus such as we have today. There is a way to finance government with no taxes, in my view. So I think if the founding fathers were entirely consistent, then I think they wouldn't have had taxes. It would have been entirely voluntary. But I think there was an element of coercion. So then break that
down. What's an example of voluntary? Like a real, not, oh, this is fun in fairy tale land, but like, how would you fund very expensive programs such as the military purely through voluntary means without taxing people?
Well, for the military, I think it's important to have a good foreign policy. And if you have a good foreign policy, then which means you stand up for the rights of Americans and you defend the rights of Americans aggressively, then I think military expenses aren't going to be that much. You're not going to be fighting $1 trillion wars like in Iraq to spread democracy to the world. That's not a proper function of the American government. It's not about protecting Americans' rights when you go to Vietnam or something to save some Vietnamese people or whatever from communism, something on the other side of the globe. The only proper function in the military is to protect the rights of American citizens. So if you have a properly restricted foreign policy, then it's going to be much cheaper to fund, and no one's going to want to fight us. I think we're just going to be so powerful. I mean, we already right now have the most powerful military in the world, and I think we'd be even vastly more powerful if we had a stronger foreign policy. I think we're far too weak today.
But we have such a dominant military and nobody wants to mess with us because we spend trillions of dollars every few years.
I don't think it's necessary to spend I mean, like I mentioned, the Iraq War is, I don't know how many billions.
No, there's tons of I totally agree with you of like offensive, completely unnecessary situations where we end up spending, I think you're about to say, trillions of dollars in wars that were not necessary. But let's say you're in the build up to World War II. That's going to be billions upon billions of dollars dumped into your military. And if you do want a powerful military, that means you have to invest in a bunch of equipment. I'm talking billions to trillions of dollars of weapons and training. And right now we have, more than 1 million people in our military being paid to be in our military. And so there's no way either you don't want a strong military or you have to invest a lot in a strong military.
I think people will invest what's needed to defend freedom. I mean, it's in their own self-interest to defend freedom. People were willing to risk their lives.
Through like donations?
Donations is one mechanism. I have a video talking about voluntary ways of financing a government in a free society. Ayn Rand also has an essay about this. Another idea, lotteries, this is one way that's been done historically, which has actually been used by some places. You can have state-run lotteries. An idea that Ayn Rand discusses is paying money to the government to enforce contracts. So if you want to have a contract with someone and then have the government enforce that contract, you could pay a fee to the government. So if there's a breach of that contract, then the government would step in and enforce that. I've heard people say the government could just invest the money it gets in the stock markets, or mutual funds, and then you're going to just build up interest based on the investments. So that's another kind of passive way of getting money.
It's interesting because while that sounds like, oh, that's cool, you could have people donate. First of all, who, if they didn't have to, especially if you're tight on money, would just contribute free? Like, we see billionaires, even people who would have the freedom to give a lot of money, go through everything humanly possible to keep every dime of their wealth through hiring, teams of lawyers to work the tax system. The idea that you would get enough money to fund all of these, even while limited, still pretty expansive programs, such as the military or police departments, through people donating or people buying lottery tickets, and then that money going towards investment in the economy. I think that's silly, but I don't really, because it's too much of a hypothetical, don't really think us arguing is going to get us there, except for me thinking that would never happen. No one ever donate, and you thinking they would. But that does bring me to thinking of hypotheticals, where, for example, the government's investing their money in the stock market. The stock market crashes. The whole economy collapses, as we've seen happen many times throughout history. What oftentimes, every time, gets us out of horrible crashes like that is the pumping of money into the economy by the government. So if that's not a part of your worldview, and the way they're making money is in the economy, what happens when the economy collapses?
I'm just taking some notes here so I can keep track. I just want to mention a few points going back to this segment on, you think it's silly, no one's going to pay for this. I think it's important to remember that in the American Revolution, people risked their lives. It was a volunteer army who fought against the British. So if people are willing to risk their lives for the cause of freedom, why won't they risk something much less, which is just some money? I think it's in people's interest to fight for their freedom, risk their lives as necessary, and donate money. And people have done this. And as to making donations, people give lots of money today to charity, even on top of all the taxes that they're already paying. So I think if there weren't so much tax, people would be more able and willing to donate money. I certainly would be. If 50% of my income is being forcibly taken away from me by the government, I'm going to be much less charitable than I otherwise would. I think it's conducive to benevolence and goodwill towards other people if you're not being coerced. If you are being coerced, I'm not as likely to want to help you out. But if you ask kindly, I will much more be willing to help you out voluntarily.
It's the same thing as people who say, in a world where there wasn't expansive government programs to help the poor, that people would just step up and help the poor. It's like, well, why hasn't that been happening then? If people are just
It has happened. If you look at the history of the 19th century, there are things like mutual aid societies.
Well, of course. Okay. Much of my family is involved in helping people all the time. So people do it. I'm saying not anywhere close to us snapping our fingers through Social Security and demolishing, elderly poverty and stuff like that. We can make differences, but not eliminate problems through expecting people to voluntarily be charitable.
I mean, I think people are going to be much better off if you have a free society than if you coerce. I mean, when you coerce, you're taking money out of productive uses. I think very few people actually need assistance from others in order to support. I think it's a tiny, tiny fraction of people who can't support themselves. You don't need masses and masses of people on the dole. I mean, if we're talking about people with Down syndrome who can literally do nothing, or even them, I've seen people with Down syndrome working at grocery clerks or grocery stands bagging groceries. So even them, there's a way for them to do something productive to support themselves. I think it's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, well under 1%, I think, who need others to help them out. And for that tiny percentage, there's going to be plenty of charity to help them out.
So if it sounds like we're in a time that you liked more, why were all of these problems prevalent enough to where people through our democratic process advocated to have a more expansive government? If previous to income taxes and stuff like that and larger welfare programs, people were just magically making money, providing for themselves, giving charitably, why is it that there was clearly all these issues that people screamed at the government through our democracy to address?
I think that's a good question. First of all, they weren't magically making money. They were making money because they had freedom and opportunity.
I should say magically, there weren't as many people magically, everyone had found out a way to make money. The finding out how to is the magic part, not the making money.
I don't think it's magical. It's a free society. It's a free market. If you allow people freedom, opportunities will develop.
Figure of
There's
speech.
Nothing magical about it. But as to why the government eventually grew more expansive, like in the progressive era and the New Deal era, I think that's probably due to influence of German philosophy. There's a book called the.
But if the problems are going to be solved through a freer market, then why were the problems there in the first place? They're not going to make a government program to solve a problem that's not there. Clearly, people were.
I mean, they were getting better. The standard of living was improving throughout the 19th century, and I think it would have continued to improve, and it has continued to improve, but at a faster rate than it has. I think we might have flying cars by now, and much better technology than we do currently. If we had stayed consistent with that 19th century model of limited government. So I think it's held us back to shift away to the more government intervention model.
We've had massive growth and innovation throughout the last 100 years.
Not nearly as much as I think there could have been. I think there's been stagnation in some areas. I mean, there used to be we've gone backwards in some ways, like supersonic jets. We used to have that, and then they went away for a while. I know someone, actually, I think maybe an objectivist, who's working on a company called Boom, which is bringing back supersonic jet travel.
I know someone who works for them. That's crazy.
Okay. Now, in areas which are much less regulated, like the computer fields, we have seen much more progress. So, tremendous progress in the computer industry, cell phones, internet, that sort of thing. But in more regulated industries, I think we are stagnating more.
So this brings us to a perfect thing that always comes to my mind. When I think, debated with the libertarians primarily, but they similarly had the beliefs that you do. So regulation is something they always zero in on. And most of them, every time I pitch a regulation, it's like, okay, well, maybe that one's okay. Maybe that one's okay. Are you saying that genuinely, or like the government should do policing to protect property, life rights and stuff like that, military, and the third one you said?
Court system.
And the court system. And literally have no involvement in any other space?
In terms of regulating, that's correct. Yeah, it shouldn't be regulating, because regulating is a form of coercion. You're forcing someone to wear a seatbelt. Roads should be private. That's another thing. Forcing someone to get a license from the government in order to practice medicine. forcing companies to adhere to certain OSHA regulations, etc. There is fraud. There is such a thing as fraud, and that's not permitted. So if you engage in fraud, if you falsely advertise a product, like if you put on you're a food manufacturer and you say this has 10 calories per serving, but it actually has 100 calories per serving, that's not legitimate. You can sue someone for that. You take them to court.
But yeah. So let's take the FDA. There's so many fun ones. Let's start with the FDA. So as long as you're not saying it's 10 calories and it's really 20, let's say it's just horribly poisonous to you. Nowhere on it does it say it's not poisonous.
No, poison is a form of force. That's like coercing someone. Instead of like sticking a gun at someone's head, you're like, I don't know, shoving poison down someone's throat.
But there's no regulatory body that's preventing companies from cutting corners, allowing terrible things to be put in foods, etc.
No, it's the free market and the court system. So there's competition. I mean, if you kill your customers, you're not going to do well for your business. It's not good for your business to kill your customers, first of all, or to even harm your customers. You get a bad reputation.
That's not true at all. Look at the opioid industry.
What? Tell me about the opioid industry.
Like,
I don't know.
Companies have made billions upon billions of dollars selling drugs, painkillers that get people hooked and way too often lead to people overdosing. They're killing their customers, and it's, gotten them into a lot of trouble. But clearly, even whenever you understand you're going to get a really bad reputation, there's incentives there when you can make tons of money and then bounce.
I don't know much about the opioid industry, but for one thing, just speaking more generally about drugs, I think drugs should be legalized. It's wrong for the government to criminalize them. As long as you're only doing harm to yourself, then it should be legal, like prostitution as well, alcohol. There shouldn't be like prohibition for forbidding people from taking drugs that they voluntarily choose. It's not to say it's good things to do, to take drugs or alcohol, but people should have the freedom to do these things. So with opioids, maybe there are some legitimate uses. I don't know if you're a cancer patient or whatever.
Oh, there's tons of legitimate uses. I'm just citing that as an example of a company harming its customers, but it still happens. Like, because you made the point that, well, no, you don't need the FDA regulating all of these products because companies will just self-regulate because it'll help their reputation. And I'm saying clearly that's not true, because we see examples now, even when there is regulation, where they still will do harmful things to their consumers.
Well, we don't have a free market now, so I don't know if now is a fair example to point to for how it's free market doesn't work.
Dan, come on, you get my point. You have to understand what I'm saying. If they're doing it now when they aren't even that free, imagine if they were completely free.
I need to know more. So you're saying
like the opioid epidemic, right? A lot of people overdosing on opioids.
Very little, like almost nothing about the opioid epidemic.
So people a lot of times, either because doctors got encouraged, paid off, or just genuinely had some horrible, medical incident happen. They need opioids to get through the pain. Manufacturers of these opioids make them, knowingly produce them to be very addictive, and massively advertise them, massively push them on doctors, so that people will get hooked on them after some sort of medical operation. And that has led to thousands of people dying from opioid overdoses.
Well, what is the state of knowledge about opioids? I mean, do you know do people know, or do they have a way to gain access to knowledge that would tell them that, if I take this, there's going to be a risk of me getting hooked on this thing. So I have to weigh, what are the risks? What are the benefits?
Totally. You can look up all data on all different drugs.
Why
very
not
publicly available.
Treat people as adults and allow them to make these decisions and say, is it worth the risk to me? Give the potential benefits of taking this. Is it worth the possible risks, the side effects that might come with it? And then you let people decide. Because
I would rather violate my no regulation belief and save a bunch of people's lives and just have some government regulation then...
Well, it's up to them to save their own lives. How about that? If they want to.
Because I think societally
there's a risk I might get hooked on this, and maybe bad things could happen, so maybe I should really think hard about whether I want to take some of this to begin with.
I think societally it's very fair to recognize that it's not reasonable to expect everyone to make the right decision all the time forever. And so putting easy guardrails in place where when people do slip up, they don't end up dying. An example of that is seatbelts. I as someone who's not always making the best decisions all the time, have driven with my seatbelt off. But because it's required, I tend to wear it on. And if I got in a car wreck, that could have been the thing that saved my life. So even someone who thinks of myself as intelligent, thinks of myself as being very thoughtful with the decisions I make, still probably would wear seatbelts much less if it wasn't a law. And that could have cost me my life. So there's easy regulations you can put in place that save people's lives or make them better, that don't violate people's freedoms in any significant way.
Well, people should be free to be irrational. I mean, it's not the government's place to force people to be rational. There's all kinds of things that are irrational. Like, I think religion is irrational. Do I want a law passed that forbids people from going to church or the mosque or the synagogue? No, I think they should be able to do that. Likewise, I think it's irrational to drive without a seatbelt, at least if you're going at a high speed. But should people be forced to do that? I don't think so. I think they should be treated as adults, and then, it's up to them. I think it's wrong to treat adults as children and then coerce them. That's imposing your beliefs on them, and I think that's wrong.
Okay, so I think the underlying thing I'm realizing is, for some reason, you have like a deep belief in freedom over even what I would characterize as like meaningful freedom, which is your life being meaningfully protected. So an example of this is building regulations, like when I go into a high rise, I'm not worried it's just going to collapse instantly, because I know there's an extensive process to get permitted and all the regulation hoops you have to jump through to build a building like that. In your world, there would be none of that. So as we see in countries that have less regulations on buildings, we in the United States have much less disasters where buildings fall down. That's why that one in Florida was such a big deal a year ago or something, compared to less developed countries that are less organized in that sense, that have more buildings just randomly collapse.
Well, the U.S. is more free than most countries in the world, so I don't know if pointing to countries is helping your case that, putting more regulations is...
Other countries have less regulation than us on building codes, for sure.
Well, what about... There's also history of, how long has the free market been able to operate in these countries? Have they developed?
But that's, okay, are you saying that as an adult, I would have to research the building that I'm about to walk into to find who built it, research to see if they're credible, to make sure that I know the building I'm about to walk in isn't going to collapse on me? Because I like being able to walk into any building and knowing, hey, if this got built here, it had to be approved by a governmental body, and that makes me feel safe because it's somewhat, stringent.
I don't think there's no, to use the word magical, there's no magical government stamp of approval that's going to protect you. I think the profit motive protects people. As I said before, it's not in your interest to kill your customers.
No, but that's wrong. Oh, but it is, though, because sometimes it is. You see so many, literally the entire 2008 financial crisis was because they were making bad decisions that eventually were going to harm their customers, but it made them a lot of money in the short term. People do prioritize short-term profits over long-term, health of their customer or safety, whatever. That's just how we see time and time again that happens.
Think about, here's an example that came to mind. Think about all the companies that recall products, like if Toyota or whatever they find there's some defect in their brakes. Do they just ignore that? No, sometimes at huge cost to themselves, they'll recall the product because they don't want their customers to suffer. And, it'll damage their reputation tremendously if they don't take actions like that. Or some bird goes in a toothpaste factory and it flies into the tub and you get a few feathers into like millions of gallons of toothpaste, and they flush the whole thing away and they announce it to the public, put out a press release to show how concerned they are about the safety of their customers.
That's an example of a company doing good things, and that doesn't make a rule, though. I just showed you the exception showing that the rule is false. Well, there isn't a rule that companies just do what's best for their customers.
But there's an explanation.
The entire fast food industry would not exist if that was true.
No, fast food. If you're, I don't think people know that fast food is not the healthiest kind of food you can eat, but I don't think, just like religion, I think that's unhealthy for your mind, but that doesn't mean it should be outlawed. Likewise, I think we have to treat adults as adults and leave it up to them to make responsible decisions about
Well, I'm not
what is
saying
healthy food
I'm not
for
saying
me
we
to
should ban fast food. I'm saying I can list off a bunch of examples of how companies, what their interest is profits. A lot of times, short-term profits, and we have a massive handful of examples. 3 have been listed so far of companies doing things, even whole industries doing things that are not in the benefit of their consumers, that harm their consumers significantly, but cutting corners or whatever they could do to make more money is oftentimes the way they go. Not always, because sometimes, like you're stating, companies are interested in their long-term reputation, stuff like that. But it is a characteristic of many companies that operate within a capitalistic system to try to make a bunch of money in the short term and cut corners to do so, leading to their consumers being harmed. And so then I'm saying, in some scenarios, I agree with you. Fast food, is that the best health decision for you? No. Do I think people should have the freedom to make it? Yeah. I mean, is there lines? I think regulating like how much sugar in the drinks and all that is fair. But generally, you can recognize fast food's bad for you, but still let it exist, as you said, with alcohol as well and all those things. But when it gets to such an intense level, like, and this is just societally, we choose where the line is, like building codes, where I am willing to roll the dice on my decision making with what food I eat and the long-term effects of that. I'm not willing to roll my dice on if I walk into some random building and haven't done my due diligence on who built it and get crushed.
Yeah, I think it's the same principle. I think the same thing that protects you in the case of food is going to protect you in the case of buildings. I don't see a principal difference there. I mean, it's not in the interest of the food company to kill you, and it's also not in the interest of the building company to kill you. And you've mentioned short-term profits a couple of times, and I think that the word short-term is key there. You're not going to do on the long term if you cut corners. The free market is what weeds those people out, those fly-by-night companies that do try to engage in bad practices and take advantage of people. Those people get weeded out. That's what the free market is excellent at. And we don't have a free market today, by the way, because there is so much regulation. I think actors like that would get weeded out much better if we didn't have regulatory apparatuses. I think Bernie Madoff might be a good example here. He was caught eventually, but I think he could have been caught a lot sooner. I think he was actually, it was someone I believe wrote, I think I heard like 3 times to the SEC about Bernie Madoff before he was actually caught. But the SEC is so busy looking over the shoulders of people who are innocent, who there's no reason to suspect or engage in any kind of fraud or bad acting, that they're not laser focused on the criminals. So it takes longer to weed out the Madoffs, et cetera. So I think without regulations, if you restrict the government to doing exactly what it should be doing, it'll do a better job at it.
So then, because every time I hear that well articulated, it's like, huh. And then 1,000 examples come to mind that prove that not to be true. So the EPA, for example, one of the things that companies do a lot, which is not in the benefit of society, but they do it anyways, is they dispose of their toxic waste in irresponsible ways. That's how a lot of pollution is caused. So let's just use like an example that has happened, but I might tweak the details just for hypothetical. So a factory is on a river, let's say, and they produce some product that produces toxic waste. And the easiest thing for them, quickest, costs $0, is to dump all the waste in the river. This is a real example, dumping toxic waste into bodies of water. Then that waste goes down the river and harms people's drinking water. There's no regulatory body that says that's not allowed, prevents that, but it's absolutely something that companies do and would do in any world in which they're allowed to.
Yeah, this is why I think property rights need to be well defined, including rights in waterways. So right now, there's a lot of public lands. I don't know how much. I think I've heard like over 50% of land in the government, like especially if you go out in the western part of the country, is public lands. But if we clearly define rights to things like rivers, then you can say, look, you're not allowed to stick your waste in this river when it's going to flow right down in stream into my section of the river. But if you just have these commons where no one in particular owns the land, then you can run into these sorts of problems. So I think the solution to this is to clearly define property rights. And then if someone violates your property rights by doing some kind of physical damage to it or polluting it, then you can take them to court and sue them.
But it wouldn't be violating. Okay. That wouldn't be violating property rights but I get what you're saying. So then someone would own the river or
at least part of the river.
And that's who it would. Does this not make you feel at all like, oh, that's a little silly? Genuinely, like that's like, oh, that world sounds perfect. Where like I walk into a doctor's office and have no clue, like I'm gonna have to interrogate/investigate this doctor to make sure they actually know what they're talking about, because there's no state body that's giving them a certificate that recognizes they have the proper amount of knowledge.
No, there can be certification, but it doesn't have to be done by the state. I mean, there already are things. I don't know if the Better Business Bureau is one of them. There could be rating agencies, consumer reports, things like Yelp. You can have all kinds of mechanisms where you're rating things, so you don't have to become an expert in whatever field it is. You can just look for, does someone have this stamp of approval from this body that's been around for decades and has acquired reputation for, saying someone is a legit business person in whatever field they are. Then just like when McDonald's, I mean, that's a brand that's been around for decades. And when you see you're going to McDonald's as opposed to, Joe's Crab Shack, and you have no idea who Joe is, you might have more confidence because the brand has been around for decades. They've sold billions of hamburgers, as they announce on their sign out there. And likewise with going to a doctor, you see this guy's been to Harvard Medical School. Harvard's been around for centuries. You acquire a reputation over time, so you don't have to become an expert in the field yourself, but you can look for indexes of expertise, such as where someone's been to school, whether they've been licensed by some board. Doesn't have to be a state board, but it could be some board that's acquired credibility over a long amount of time.
I mean, a great example of this is, again, the 2008 crisis. There were private rating agencies that were rating them not very accurately, causing people to get loans that weren't at all what they should be getting a loan for. So I don't know. I just think, to me, this is the same vibe I get from communists when I talk with them. It's like every problem, just because it's a fun hypothetical world, would have a magical solution. When you look at like an example of a market operating just in a free way, people, not saying it's completely a free market, but I'm saying the free aspects of it still open the market up to massive problems that can only be solved through the societal body that we call government, that kind of has ultimate authority over the private sector. So it's like, not ultimate authority, but you get my point, is able to regulate the private sector. And so it's like assuming that all of these things that went bad that caused us to create regulations for them just wouldn't happen because it's a magical, it's a fun hypothetical objectivist world, is super naive to me. It's the same reason like communists think that everything will just work, even though it time and time again hasn't. It's the same vibe I get from you.
Yeah, I don't buy that this is just a complete fairy tale sort of system. I mean, I think history bears it out. The more free countries there have been have done better than the less free countries. North Korea versus South Korea, East Germany versus West Germany, Soviet bloc versus the Western bloc. The United States in the 19th century, I think, was growing very well, and there was tremendous progress in that area. In that era, tons of inventions. You had, it was so horrible that millions of people from Europe were immigrating here.
Again, that's like the most black and white understanding. Either you're completely free or completely oppressed and under an authoritarian state. Yes, I agree that North Korea is worse than in the way that people are treated than all the Western countries. But also going all the way in the other direction isn't necessarily the solution. Like, let's have absolutely nothing or an authoritarian government. Like, that's our two options.
Well, there are certainly degrees, but I'm saying the more free a country is, the better it's done. And I think various examples, these countries are all on spectrums. South Korea is not perfectly free, but it's, much more freer than North Korea. It's probably not as free as the United States, at least during certain parts of its history. But I think if you look at the broad sweep of history, what you find is that the freer countries have done better. They've prospered more. So I don't think this is just like some detached from reality, pie in the sky fairy tale that there's no historical basis for. I think history actually backs it up, and it shows that the more you coerce, the worse things get. With like countries like Soviet Union or North Korea being at the extreme end of that spectrum.
So that I'm so happy you said coercion. I forgot to bring that back up. Okay, so I agree that more having free societies is amazing and lead to the best outcomes. It's just, how are we defining free? Because I think a lot of times the more libertarian, small government, and then in your case, objectivist thinking makes you go, oh, I don't like coercion. I don't like the lack of freedom. So I want, but you only define that as the government putting that on to people. But whenever you take away completely any intervention of the government, you're going to have coercion. You're going to have the lack of freedom. It's just not going to be coming from the government. So, for example, monopolies. Why was it something very early on that people within our government established, like we should have the ability to break up monopolies? Because you see a situation where even in a wonderful free market, companies are able to consolidate so much power that they now own that industry, own that market, and no one can compete with them. Little small businesses can't even try. And they end up being able to, an example of this is insulin, jack up the price 10x on people. That's coercing people out of money that they should not be having to pay for a life-saving drug. And so now you're just having a company coerce you for your money instead of the government. Now it's coercion through, insulin, not taxation, but it's coercion nonetheless. So I think that's kind of where the disconnect is you're going to have a situation if you just leave all the other powers besides the government to do what they wish, where people get oppressed, people get coerced, and people lose freedom. It just isn't coming from the government.
Okay, so I think we might have a difference here on what coercion means, because I think coercion necessarily requires physical force, and that doesn't happen, in my view, when a company is simply making a trade. Maybe you don't like the terms of the trade. Maybe you think it's they're charging too much for whatever they're proposing to trade you. But if they're not using physical force, if they're not threatening you, then they're not coercing you. So sometimes an example that I like to use is islands cases. I don't know, maybe you've heard some of these. Vosh has his coconut island example. It's just kind of vulgar, so I won't use exactly that. But if I'm on an island, or both of us are on an island, and I've got some food supplies and you don't have anything, and I say, I'll give you some of my food if you do something really distasteful, or like eat worms or something. We can make it less vulgar than Vosh's. Or if you just if you do jumping jacks for a week straight and you just do nothing else, I'll give you one coconut if you do that. Am I coercing you? I don't think so. I think you could say I'm a nasty person for making such an offer, but I'm not coercing you. I think I would be coercing you if I threatened you with a stick or something. I was threatening to beat you, or if I actually did beat you, then I would be coercing you. But if I just make you an offer which you don't like the terms of, I would say that's not coercion.
So it's just force, and that then I understand your definition of coercion, and I can apply that to your previous statements. But that to me just makes it further obvious that this is an unrealistic and not logical worldview. And the reason is here, if I'm saying meaningful coercion or to me the lack of complete freedom, but let's just use coercion for a second. If it's you and me on an island, you get there after I got there, and I have all of the food, and then I say you have to work for me indefinitely, as much as I want, whatever I want you to do, if you want me to feed you. I'm the only person who can give you food. I'm not threatening you with violence, but you're gonna die if you don't have my food. So it's maybe. What do you mean maybe? What you
I mean, I
gonna
could
do? Eat
fish
the
for
sand?
myself. Imagine I'm the only one there myself. You know, if I'm there myself and there's no one else, I'm going to have to do something. Now, maybe if you're also there and you've been there for longer and you've already found a way to support yourself, you can make it easier for me by offering me a trade. But the default is me versus nature. It's man alone versus nature. So, you know, I can take my own risk to, and I have to take my own risk if they're all alone, but I'm not being coerced. What if I'm there just by myself? There's no one else on the islands. I have no choice but to try to fish or find some berries or something. Am I being coerced?
I think you missed. I'm not talking about a real situation where we're on an island. I'm saying here's an example of your only option for food is me.
But it's not.
Regardless of no. This is like when people don't.
Right,
this is like whenever you give some hypothetical and you're like, "Hey, what would you do if you had one bullet and had to kill this person or this person?" And you're like, "I would shoot through both their heads." It's like, well, that's not the point of the hypothetical. I'm saying if we thought of a situation where I was the only person who could provide you food.
Okay.
And then the scenario I just played out. You have to come to me for food. That's the hypothetical. Then I'm not violently threatening you, but you are coerced to do what I want you to do. Is in my opinion.
Why?
Okay, so you'd believe that.
Yeah.
You believe that wouldn't be coercion.
Yeah, if you're just making me an offer, which might be a really nasty offer, but you're not threatening force, you're not doing anything physical like harming me with a stick, then you might be a nasty person, but I'd say you're not coercing me. Okay.
And I'll completely accept that that's your definition of coercion. And that to me says for some reason you value a very unique definition of freedom and a very unique definition of not having coercion, and in such a way that you want to create a world where those things are in the place you want them to be, but that wouldn't at all be the best outcome for society. It would just somehow check the box that you want to check for no conceivable reason. Like if that's the definition of coercion and you don't want anything's fine unless it's that, then you're going to have a devastating society.
Unless it's that.
I'm saying within the coercion conversation. Sorry, go ahead.
I mean, coercion is one bad thing, but it's not the only bad thing. Like I said, you might be a nasty person for making an offer like, I'm only going to give you some food, assuming you're the only one. If you have the food and you say, I'm only going to give you some of it if you eat some slugs or something, you're probably a nasty person. So that's a bad thing. Coercion is also a bad thing, but it's not the only bad thing.
Well, I'm not saying, yeah, no, I get what you're saying. It's not talking about morality. I'm just saying that from the perspective of what the government should and shouldn't be doing, if you're saying that, like, I would rather there be some level of, I think a better society is formed when you allow some level of threat of force. That's the monopoly on violence that people talk about with the government. And that yields the best outcomes. It's only if it's through a democratic society where you're able to check that government that has a monopoly on force. But I would much rather there be some level of the threat of force in life and that level of coercion than all of the other forms of coercion that I think are coercion that don't technically fall into the threat of force.
I mean, I think it's important to have a clear concept of force. And one thing that I'm concerned about is when you expand the concept of coercion in the way it seems you might want to, then a lot of things end up being called coercion that I don't think are, but then by calling them that, they become justification for doing things that I think are bad. So like if you think it's coercive for a company to charge a certain price for gasoline or food or whatever, now because we've called it coercion, now we can coerce that company into lowering their prices, or else their CEO is going to have to go to jail or whatever. So we're licensing actual coercion under the pretense that they are engaged in coercion. So that's one thing I'm concerned about here when you have this expansive concept of coercion, which is not clearly defined, and which I think is very vague. And there's not going to be any clear way. What you might think is coercive, maybe you think it's coercive to charge, I don't know, $50 for a gallon of gasoline, but someone else thinks, oh, it's already coercion if someone charges $25, and somebody else thinks it's coercion if you charge $10. This is highway robbery. We're not going to let them get away with that. We have to, defend ourselves. And so there's no clear way to draw the line. But if you have a clear concept of coercion, which I think Ayn Rand does, which is actual physical threats of force, then you have an objective way, a principled way of settling these kinds of issues. Otherwise, it's just deuces wild.
And I'm totally fine defining coercion as whatever, as anything. So if it's, for the purposes of this conversation, if we just want to say it's the threat of force, is that what you said? The threat of force or physical force? That's fine. And that just makes it so clear, in my opinion, to everyone that clearly that has to be prevalent, because all these other bad things, or has to exist. Some threat of force has to exist for a society to function. Otherwise, all these other horrible things are going to happen. And that's where kind of like, I understand why you need to define it like that, because then that's the thing you're trying to avoid in your ideal society. And I'm just saying, when it is defined as that and you're trying to avoid that, you end up in a situation where you're expecting of a person existing in society to do an inhuman amount of work on a daily basis to stay alive, to make sure that everything is safe in their life, when you could just outsource that to the societal body that we all buy into, kind of we all within the social contract buy into, that can take care of that for you, so you can live a more free life, free of the burden of having to constantly wonder if your doctor's actually certified, constantly wonder if the building is safe that you're walking into, constantly, as we go on.
I mean, I think that's a straw man position of what I'm advocating. I don't think there is a need to constantly be worried and wondering about whether the building you're in is going to fall. Just as, already there's no constant worry that, the shoes I buy are going to, the soles are going to fall off of them, even though we don't have a shoe agency like we have an federal and drug agency. I mean, there's tons of products that are not regulated by the governments. And as I said, there is the competition effects. You weed out bad actors over time, and if there is even with that going on, you still have some bad actors trying to cut corners. These people can get caught and thrown in jail, fines. So
what would they get thrown in jail for? There was nothing they did wrong. They just cut corners. They're allowed to. They didn't violate any law.
Fraud would be a jailable or at least finable kind of offense. Like the thing about false advertising, if you say your product has 10 calories per serving, it actually has 100, that would be a form of fraud.
Right. But
in my system,
I'm not referring to that,
you could be penalized for that. So right. I don't think there is going to be this constant need to worry about all these things without governments, regulators coercing people.
So, to be clear, kind of the difference in our two worldviews. I obviously don't think regulation is all good or all bad. I think you could overregulate for sure. You could underregulate. You could have too many government programs. You could have too little government programs. It's just finding that balance. And based on every real world example, I can think up a world where you allow some government intervention outside of just the things you've outlined is a much safer, happier, healthier, even freer society, in my opinion. Even if that means, in a sense, you're coerced to pay taxes, and you don't believe that. And I think that's kind of the furthest we can go. Is there any other kind of main thing you wished to have said?
Well, just one thought on that last point. Is a question I would put to you or anyone who holds your sort of view is like, where do you draw the line? So you say that I think, maybe there's such thing as over-regulation, but we got to have maybe some taxes are too much, but some amount is okay. But where do you draw that line? I don't think you have a principled way of drawing those sorts of lines. And I think that creates a problem. There's no, and it can create slippery slopes as well. Like, I think taxation might be a good example here. Like when it started, people are, it's crazy. You're going to tax us like 3%? That's crazy. We've had no taxation for decades, or for maybe an entire person's life back in the 19th century. Now you want to tax us 1%? And now, look what it's up to. 30%. If you can tax 1%, why not 2%? Not just one more percent. If 2%, why not 3? Why not 4? So where does it end? If you don't have a principled reason, then it's just subjective and arbitrary where you draw that line, and it becomes a sliding scale.
It's definitely going to be subjective, as is every prescriptive statement on how our government should operate. Even thinking that being free is a good thing. Who Is that objective? Well, not really. What we have to do is look at, the great thing is because we have a good amount of history in multiple different countries, as well as looking at countries in the modern day. You look at how effective current systems work right now. You look at historically how different things have gone. And then I think that's why you set up a democracy that, as much as it's annoying, operates pretty slowly. So people have a say, but because there's a lot of checks on power, you can't swing too much in one direction or another. That's why we see our government operate pretty slowly and change in the change metric. But understanding that, like, let's say there's a spectrum between black and white. A lot of that's gray, right? Neither of us could tell you exactly when it becomes black to gray and then gray to white, but we know there's a black on one side and white on one end, and there's a gray in the middle. So yes, of course, in the gray area, knowing exactly where that line is a constant journey. But if the best place is in that gray area, just because it's going to be a constant push and pull of, do we go more in one direction or another, doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt at all to be in that space and just go to one radical end or another. And as we've seen, programs that were fought for, that some people thought were good, some people thought bad, that have been implemented have made people's lives materially better. And that's awesome, even though, of course, you can't know for sure, especially in a democracy, how far something will be taken. Where is the tax rate eventually going to go? It's relating to the times, the available research you have on the effectiveness of a particular thing that you're proposing, and different times call for different levels of response. So back when when America was under the current sets, of conditions that it was in the time that we had lower taxes, maybe that was the best option. And then we move forward, times change, and we feel like, hey, income inequality has gotten, even larger. Let's tax the top a little bit more. So no, I don't think it's like objectively 5% is the number we need, or objectively 3 major government programs, or it's just, what does the moment call for, what problems need solving, and then how does that work within the democracy?
Yeah, I don't think you have any way to decide that. I think it's
democracy,
arbitrary. No, democracy is mob rule if it means unlimited majority rule. I don't think the majority has the right to vote away the rights of the
that's why you have a constitution that sets up a situation where there's checks on power, and the majority can't just rule completely. That's like what the Senate does.
So if you have a majority, I think how do you decide what the majority should be able to vote on? So like, what if the majority wants to enslave
representatives? They don't vote on particular issues. They vote on representatives. And if you were in a society where they did that, that would be horrible. Just like how if you were in a society that wasn't a democracy, a dictator could decide to enslave everyone. Yes, you have to have some buy-in to the concept of the Constitution that establishes that you can't violate people's rights to that extent.
Well, how about taxes? Should people be able to violate rights by taking away 80% of your income? Should that be subject to majority vote? So if majority wants to take away 80% of your income,
but within the creation of the but whenever you're establishing the country that you're going to then have people buy into, and the concept, at least in the example of America and all the countries I'm aware of, you put within that body of work that establishes what people's rights are, that it is not a violation to tax people. It does lay out that Congress has the power to tax.
Yeah, that's part of the original Constitution, Article 1. I think Congress has the power to tax, and I think that's a problem. But I don't think just because something is allowed by a Constitution doesn't make it right. I mean, slavery was allowed by the original Constitution, but does that legitimize it? I don't think so. I think there's some
and neither does like any philosophical lens absolutely relies on or belief people also buying into that philosophical belief. So yes, if we're in a society where people believe slavery is not a violation of people's rights, whether it's a dictator who believes that and they make it happen, or it's a democracy and they make it happen, it's going to happen. That's horrible. There's like literally no way to prevent that through any philosophical lens.
Well, there are times when pretty much everyone thought slavery was okay, and everyone would try to enslave everyone else. The concept of individual rights, I think, wasn't really discovered in a major way until John Locke which was the 17th century. And then on the basis of his ideas, the founding fathers of this country set up the United States. But I think there is progress that's been made in human understanding of what a proper sort of government is. So I think, whatever philosophic ideas are common at the time, that's going to influence,
of course, we agree on that,
of governments that people bring into being. But I think there are objectively better and worse governments.
I agree.
And I think, looking at history and having a certain theory of ethics, we haven't talked much explicitly about ethics, but I think that's key to understanding what a proper political system would be. But I mean, I don't think it's subjective. I think it is objective as to what is a good sort of government to have. And I think one that has an objective concept of force or coercion is that's important, to have an objective concept of force. If you don't, I think that there's something fundamentally wrong with the sort of society you're envisioning. And it's not going to be stable either.
So, unfortunately, because I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have an example of the society that you hope for, nor me. So neither of us.
Well, we have something close to the one. I think that late 19th century America is probably the closest a country has ever come to the sort of system I envision.
And the the funny thing is, in the example you said that my lens would allow for situations like slavery, and that's a perfect example of the significant oppression of black people in the time you're talking about.
No, late 19th century. This is after. Oh, there was Jim Crow.
No, I said oppression. I know, past slavery.
Yeah.
My point is, though, let's just say because of that, because clearly that's coercion.
Slavery or Jim Crow.
Yeah. Yes, both. But I'm saying, like, clearly there's parts that weren't ideal. So now we're looking at, and mine too. Of course, America's not perfect now, and it's more regulated than it was before. So the only way that we could, quote unquote, objectively know which system was better is to have like defined metrics that we value. And the process of valuing certain metrics, because that's how you get to something objective, is you have to be able to measure something. And us deciding which things are valuable to measure is going to be a subjective process. So I might say, I want GDP to be higher. I want, unemployment to be lower. Like, what leads to those things? Or poverty to be lower, infant mortality. And you might say, well, no, those aren't the most valuable things to me. These are. So what you value is completely subjective. And that's why saying objectively, this is a better society rarely works unless it never works. That never happens.
You're raising a big issue, and I think it's an important issue, which is, objectivity. Is there such a thing, or is it all subjective in the final analysis? Ayn Rand has quite a bit to say about that. Especially one place is in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She tries to give a objective theory of value in general, not just what is the proper form of government, but what is an objective value. And one way she tries to solve this is by saying that the concept of value depends on the concept of life. That's where there wouldn't be values without life. If there were no living things, if there were just rocks or, water, air in the universe, and there weren't any living beings, there would be no values, because values presuppose something that an entity that is capable of valuing, something that can act for the sake of things. And a rock is not acting for the sake of anything. It's not trying to do anything. But living things do try to do things. Namely, they try to live. They try to stay in existence. So this one difference between living things and non-living things is living things can they can go out of existence. So if a living organism doesn't take certain actions, if this plant doesn't turn its leaves to the sun or reach its roots out to get some water, it's going to die. But what does a rock have to do to survive? It doesn't have to take any certain action. It just has to not be impinged by certain external things, like not get pulverized by a glacier or something. but absent external forces on it, it doesn't have to do anything positively to continue in existence, whereas living things do. We have to eat. Human beings have to get shelter in certain circumstances, at least. Food, clothing, shelter, and to make their lives even better, they have to do things like build technology, create medicines. There are many things that objectively they must do if they're going to stay alive. So I think by seeing values in the context of life, that could be one way to lend some objectivity to the notion of valuing. There's much more that could be said about this, but that's just a little hint about how Ayn Rand solves this issue.
If that's true, and the core purpose of life is to stay alive generationally, so it's often to reproduce with, with animals and stuff, and so it doesn't at all compute, because I guess some people would say, no, the way that you find objective values is to look to things that exist, whether or not we're naming it and defining it. And an example of that is like the biological will to reproduce. Okay. So instantly you can understand why that's not even accurate. I don't even know if this is the point you're trying to make, but kind of see how this hits you. In a society where you were really just trying to keep the society going, you could do some horrible things to make that happen. If you were just trying to, reproduce the most, generationally exist for the longest term. This could include, prioritizing the life of people who have the best genetics and all of these things and are the most fertile, and violating other people's what we now define as rights to that end. And that's why people throughout history have believed in horrible things like forced castration and stuff like that. And so some people value a super strong, healthy, genetically genetically dominant society. And that would lead to horrible things in my value system, because I value individual rights, but that's not objective. One's not objectively better in the sense of, which value is the correct value. It's just different value sets. So this is all subjective. Once we define what our values are, then you can objectively measure.
So, I mean, so you think it's in the final analysis, it is all subjective, but then here's the question. Where did you originally get the notion of good or of value? What gave rise, what experience of yours, if it was an experience, where did you originally get this idea of good? Because I think if you can answer that question, that might be a lead to finding objectivity.
Well, no, my answer will show that it is subjective. I mean, some people believe that it comes from God, but I think you can't deny it comes from the environment that you're in, the family that you're raised by. Those are where your values come from.
Hold on, with God, I don't think that can be the original source of it, because let's say you're a baby, you don't understand words yet, but you value things. I mean, you value your mother's milk. Let's say you have this experience that you enjoy,
but that's a natural thing your body knows to do to stay alive. And I agree with you. Wanting to stay alive is a characteristic of life, in nature. Well,
it doesn't even know anything about that it's alive yet, but it has pleasure. Certain things I think this actually could help provide some objectivity to the notion of values. Pleasure. So we have a biologically inbuilt pleasure pain mechanism. So we come into this world built in a certain way, such that if you eat food when you're hungry, it gives you pleasure, not pain. And if you trip on a rock and scrape your knee, it causes pain, not pleasure. there's no choice about that. That's just the way that we are built. Some things give us pleasure and some things give us pain. And I think that can provide an objective basis. And I think that's our original. I asked you, where do you originally...
That's not how you define if something's good or bad. Because
I think it's
people can get pleasure out of raping somebody.
Get the concept of, where does the original idea of good and bad come from? I think it comes from pleasure and pain. Now my point is, we do define what's good and bad in, societally, which makes it a subjective conversation. Wait, we define good and bad societally.
Yes.
Not sure
some groups that you're in think some things are. For example, I've been in spaces where being gay is heavily looked down upon. It is their value system leads them to believe that is bad. And then I've been in spaces where it's celebrated. So clearly, groups define what is good, what is valuable, what is admired, based on a bunch of subjective beliefs and factors.
Well, when you say groups define, I mean, human beings are, I mean, individuals. Groups are made up of individuals. So, I mean, some individual in a group can say, I don't like gays, or I do like gays. And then it's up to other individuals to also make that decision. I mean, if my next door neighbor tells me,
which is subjective.
Well, wait a minute. I don't see that follows. The fact that there are different opinions, I don't think means that the nature of the opinion is necessarily subjective. Like I'm of the opinion that 2 + 2 is 4, and that the Earth is round. Now, if someone else is of the opinion that 2 + 2 is 5, or that the Earth is flat, we have different opinions. But does that mean that my opinion that 2 + 2 is 4 and that the Earth is round is subjective? I don't think so. I think I have objective reason.
But you're talking about measurements, though. Yes, and like things you can observe in the physical world. We're talking about values that are not anything you can measure.
Yes. Okay. Now going back to the pleasure pain thing. If I think that, eating food when I'm hungry gives me pleasure, and now that's something I think anyone is going to experience, like regardless of who you are. This is one reason why I think going back to the pleasure pain mechanism, which is biologically inbuilt, could be a source of objectivity. There's some things which just give you pleasure or pain, whether you want them to or not.
But that's not factual, because if you experience the pleasure of eating certain food too much, you're going to harm yourself.
Sure, if you eat it too much, but if you eat it in the right quantity, it gives you pleasure.
But you're killing me, because you're saying that we can derive objectivity within our analysis of what is good and bad in society. Like, we can define what is good and bad in society and what values we should seek out, what values we value through objective measurements and through an objective worldview. And I'm saying that's impossible, and you're saying no, it's not, because we have pleasure and pain, which are like inherent, so you can derive objective analysis from that. And I'm saying, well, no, because you can do a lot of things that feel pleasurable that are not good for you within what we define to be as good. There's a disconnect between the objective stuff that you're talking about and how we decide what is valuable and what is good and what is bad in society.
Well, I think there are many steps. Like, you can't go straight from, food gives me pleasure and scraping my knee on a rock gives me pain, to we should have a laissez-faire capitalism government. I mean, that's a huge leap. I think there are many, 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 many steps.
And you think all those steps are objective?
They can be. I mean, you can make mistakes along the way, and I think part of the process, part of the challenge of being a human is figuring out what the right steps are. And as I mentioned, like, getting to the stage of understanding what individual rights are took until John Locke. And I think even he didn't get it fully in the 17th century. He thought the rights came from God. And I don't even think there is a God. So I don't think he had a fully consistent concept of rights that was entirely coherent with a rational, logical philosophy. But I think he made a lot of important steps in the right direction. And I think Ayn Rand completed a secular understanding of the theory of rights. But humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years, making all kinds of mistakes and false starts. But I think ultimately there is an objective story you can tell as to why a certain political system is objectively the best, but it's not obvious. I think it does take a lot of explanation, and you can't just go from the biological fact that certain things give you pleasure, certain things give you pain, to it immediately follows from that capitalism of the sort Ayn Rand advocates, is the proper system.
Here's what happens, just so you're aware. Yeah. Like, this is what's happening with your ideology. When you picture, well, that's a big jump, it's because somewhere in there that you're jumping from objective to subjective. So you're thinking to yourself, I can kind of come up with these objective things, how we, crave food and we eat it and that keeps us alive. And that's kind of like a inherent process. And it's clearly a long jump all the way to objectivism, but you could get there. But I'm saying you can't get there without at some point saying, we value this because we value it, not because there's an objective measurement. You can have an explanation for it, but what is good is up to humans' decision-making, subjective view on the world. So even valuing individual rights, like let's say that you were someone trying to craft a society and you thought, I want to keep the society alive. That's why I want as many people. That's going to be the best chance for it to, across generations, last a long time. That's my goal. I value that. And so I'm going to have it set up where, how do I not say this in a really gross and vile way? Like, women's rights aren't respected in getting pregnant over and over to make as many babies as possible. But then I would say that's bad because I value individual rights. That would be violating the woman's individual right, to bodily autonomy. So then that's just like a subjective decision. You could think generationally bigger populations is better. I could think individual rights with smaller populations is better. There's no way you can objectively come to a conclusion about what is good and bad in society. Once you define what you're aiming for subjectively, then you can decide which measurements you'll measure and measure those objectively. So I can say, I value unemployment, and we can objectively measure unemployment.
Okay. I think some things are optional. So, for example, chocolate and vanilla. I mean, you might like chocolate. I might like vanilla. I'm not going to say one is objectively better. Like, we should both like chocolate or we should both like vanilla. No, there are certain things which I think are properly individual matters, or career. You might have a passion to be an engineer, and someone else might have a passion to be a dentist. And I'm not going to say one of those is objectively better. But I will say it's objectively better to eat chocolate or vanilla rather than mud, if you're a human being. Also, I will say it is objectively better to be an engineer or a dentist rather than a serial killer. So I think there are certain limitations,
but even
which
then,
you can say are objectively
I don't think we're going to get anywhere with that, because then it's like, well, why? The reason why we don't like serial killers is because violating the right to life of the people that the serial killer is killing. But valuing life and valuing not taking away others' lives is a subjective value. But we're not going to get anywhere with that. I think we have too big of a gap on this one. But I think we'll have to wrap it up there. Is there anything else you want to say? It's been a pleasure. You're fun to talk to.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. So I don't have any. I'm sure we could go on forever with this, but
yeah, feel free. We'll schedule another time at some point, because I'm sure we could do a whole nother conversation.
Okay, yeah. Maybe I should just drop a link in the chat if that's okay with you. And
I think it's every time they try to send me links, it doesn't take it. But
okay, well, I can just say what it is again. My YouTube channel.
Say it, and then when I upload this to my channel as a video, I'll put it in the description.
Okay, so It's youtube.com/Dan Norton1. And I'm also on Twitter at Dan Norton111. So you can follow me there. Thanks again for having me on. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Have a wonderful evening.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.